DevOps practitioner, serves as a director for cloud application services and technology at T-Systems, something that is truly exciting for him. He bagged accolades at the DOI's 2021 edition with a runner-up title under the SRE Leader of the Year category. He has continued his efforts in enhancing the concept of SRE in reality for service-based industry. We are very pleased to have him on board with us at the DOIs, wherein he shall be highlighting a customer's SRE journey with key focus on the importance of customer value and feedback. Coming to capture your screens is the one and only Mr. Rohit Sinha.
My name is Rohit, and today we are going to talk about unlocking error budget value management for site reliability engineers in shared service model. When we start, before we start this, let's quickly look back at site reliability engineering itself, what it stands for, and then we are going to talk about a little bit on the quantitative side of how we can look at it from a quantitative view. We will also look at how do we define what is called as measurement of reliability. We'll also look at the framework for SRE error budget, which has been put in place especially for the shared services, keeping in mind things like ITSM-based data, component-based data, and things of that sort. And then how it has to be rolled out, parameters which have to be kept in mind, and this is a trusted and tested setup which we in our organization are following it. And then we'll talk about a couple of examples, especially on deployment and change, and how did we use, we coined another term which is more to do with the failure perspective and how we define that. And also the maturity model, what is the next growth path? What are the things which we have to watch out for? What are the hiccups which we have come through, and what is the thought process which we have to keep in mind? So these are the things which we are going to cover today from a perspective of site reliability engineering and the quantitative world of error budget. Now, before we get into the real quantitative world, let's look at the principles which define site reliability engineering, right? And I've just highlighted them in different colors, as you can see, right? There's a reason behind it, because a lot of quantitative, calculations and targets are actually in error budgeting, which is the second of the 7 which we have defined. Now, error budget alone is not the only quantitative analysis which we have. So we have, if we dig a little bit deeper, we'll figure out that, it also brings in managing toil, which is also indirectly or directly related to the budgeting. And also a very important cultural shift which happens, which is about embracing risk. When we talk about embracing risk, we talk about the situation where are we giving our systems or our teams or our SREs a framework where they can actually take a calculated risk. It's very important. And then we come down to a point where it is about the output of this. Okay. And the outputs are mostly around, monitoring and advanced monitoring, making it better. Automation is also an output always of what we have understood, what can be automated, and then the release engineering and the simplicity, which comes again from a cultural shift. So we are going to talk about all of this, and other principles will obviously indirectly support it, but some of them are outcomes and some of them are indirectly embedded into it. First, to understand how do we intend to define reliability. That is very important, right? Reliability is like sometimes very difficult to measure, right? Not everything is about green dashboards and SREs. So we have to be very, very specific about how do we intend to make people understand what do we mean by reliability, right? And how do we measure? Now, reliability is a very generic term, and it can vary from organization to organization. It can vary from different areas, different companies, and things of that sort. So, from a perspective of reliability, this is how we defined it from a customer standpoint, and our approach. And I will keep on stressing this as we go along in the session, is very customer specific. The output, it has to be visible. It is not only an output on the dashboard. It has to really make things better. Okay. Now, higher reliability or resilience is coming through, we define it as better quality as number one, for sure. Quality is something which we don't compromise it. It's non-negotiable. And then on the throughput, what do we mean by throughput? The higher throughput is about being faster. Now, being faster does not always necessarily mean being faster internally to look at only OPEX, which is mostly the case in managed services or shared services, where people try to squeeze, we call it squeezing of the lemon, where you try to squeeze in as much of OPEX as possible, but it has to be, the throughput has to be relevant to the end user, to the end customer, right? So that's how we define reliability. Obviously, if we are going faster, we are leaning and meaning this the system, which means reduction of toil will definitely happen at some point of time. Our error budget, or what we call as the target which we want to reach, and in deeper terms, site SLOs, right, would depict exactly what is relevant for the end user and the customer. It has nothing to do with only KPIs and individual contract KPIs. Yes, they're important. Yes, the contractual obligations are there, and yes, they have to be kept in mind, but a happy customer is about looking at reliability. Does the customer or the end user look at you as a reliable service provider, right? Or a reliable organization who is going to provide service to you? And that is very important. And we have to put a quantitative measure around it and look at value adding and not only following an SLA on a contractual obligation, right? Before we jump into the framework part of things, we have to be very cognizant of the fact that the element of cultural shift is huge in site reliability engineering. It's also about customer looking at you as a reliable service provider, as I talked about. It happens only when, as a service provider, you react when things go wrong, at the same time keeping the contractual obligations, and at the same time being a troubleshooter. That's how you define reliability. Now, these terms which I talked about just now, very difficult to do a quantitative analysis on it, but we try to figure it out using a framework which we try to develop internally, which works for the organization which I work for. Now, it can be that it might require a certain degree of tweaking for another organization to work like that. And also, there is another element of transparency. We actually wanted SREs to be in front of the customer. We tried to change that anti-pattern where people look at SRE as an automation engineer. In many cases, the implementations are going all over the place as we speak. Some of them look at SRE as somebody who is a problem solver only when things really go wrong in a crisis situation. Uh, some organizations look at SRE as only an OPEX tool for ensuring that we do as much of efficiency as possible. Well, none of them are totally absolutely wrong, but none of them are absolutely right either. In our definition of SRE, we wanted to put it customer first. Okay. Now, the framework which we are going to talk about today is going to consist of three parts. So, one is obviously the SRE assignment itself. All right, we have decided that we have to, roll out site reliability engineering. It's going to be helpful for us. How many SREs do I need? How will I start off with? Ideally, in an ideal scenario, we don't need to, really define an SRE, because an SRE is now nobody but another team member who does 50% of the times the SRE work and 50% of times the normal operations or the DevOps or deployment or whatever the work is assigned. But in this case, to kickstart, in our framework, we also have a setup where we talk about SRE assignment. This is rolling out of SREs right into the organization. So how do we give that weightage? There is a parameterized based holistic approach in which, based on how do we define, how much time for a work which we are doing, and it comes from the ITSM data of change, deployment, and incident, all the way up to projects which we are doing and what we have learned from it. How much can be a reusability factor into it from an availability, fault tolerant, latency perspective, as well as from a major incident perspective. Now, I will go one by one on each of them, but before that, I would like to define how do we use this for defining an SRE. And that this data crunching happens when you look at the type of work which the teams are doing, and based on that, you define how close are they to actually the contractual obligations. Are they really going very close to what is defined as an SLA? Are they going really close to what is defined as a deployment setup? And every time they're spending or churning a lot of toil because they're doing the same thing, but they do not have a mechanism in which it is automated. So these calculations are done based on all the 7, 8 parameters which you see on the left-hand side of the screen. Now, let me be very honest, these are not the only parameters you have to look into. This is just a sample, and this is a sample from one of the teams which we have. We have different type of structure of analysis when it comes to different teams. but the model remains the same, that we are going to look at what is recordable items, which are from an ITSM standpoint. We are also going to look at what type of projects and the reusability factor which are coming from a request and project perspective. We also look at, if there are, requirements contractually from availability or even from a latency or a non-functional requirement perspective, right? But in all of this, there is one factor which has the highest weightage, which is about customer feedback. We cannot discount the customer out of this. We have to ensure that we always define it. The customer is the one who is going to really look at what is beneficial for them. It doesn't mean that they will be taking that decision. The decision is still ours from an SRE standpoint, but we take their requirements, or I would say their thoughts before ours, of how we look at a system and how we can put in a lot of other factors around SRE into it, right? So that based on those, we have a framework in detail, and over there we can define, okay, these are the number of SREs which should be designated in the teams based on all of these factors, right? And the same factors which we use for defining even the error budget, which we'll talk about next when I go through each of these parameters going forward, right? It's a weightage based, average based mechanism based on all these parameters, and customer is obviously given the highest weightage, and I cannot stress enough on it, because that requires a lot of assessment, that requires going back to the customer, that requires talking to the end user and understanding what is their pain area, not only based on some CSAT or green dashboards, which have been the norm throughout, right? Now, parameters and usage to be explained from a perspective of how do we look at it. Now, don't go by the numbers on the right hand side. That's a percentage variation which we have given based on the project, but we'll talk about these 7 parameters and more, which might be applicable. And I'll try to fit in different scenarios in each of this. Now, in a managed services or shared services perspective, we know that a lot of ITSM-based setup works on incident management, but the lesser the incident, the better it is for the customer, right, or for the end user. They're really not bothered about that, but it is very important from a quality standpoint. So we make a lot of dashboards around incidents. But incidents are important, but they are not as majorly important as it should be. Normal incidents, major incidents obviously follow a different track altogether. Change quality or a deployment quality, I call it change quality, but it's same as if we look at it from a DevOps development deployment perspective, it's the same. Now, from a change quality or deployment quality perspective, we look at the quality of the change which is happening, the releases which are happening, the deployments which are happening, and how quick are we doing it? Because if you remember, our reliability, one of the major important principles is actually the concept of having faster throughput. So we look at how fast we can do it, but at the same time we also have a concept internally which we call as failure budget in this, which is about defining, giving a grading score to each of the teams based on their deployment quality, and that quality is based on, and it is one of the examples which I'll share in the subsequent slides, where we provide them a clean path or a green path, we call, if they have been doing pretty well with their deployments for say a period of 6 to 8 months or 9 months, then they have the luxury of going and doing a deployment straight away by actually foregoing some of the quality gate gaps which are around it, provided they meet the SLO, not the SLA. We need to provide a safety net for sure for them. So even if things go south, they are not in any way taking that risk without a safety net underneath. So our SLOs are always much more elevated than what our SLAs are. So that's how we define the change quality. Every team would be given a certain number of credit points, and if they keep on breaching those SLOs for say 2 or 3 times, then they go back to the entire quality gate process all over again. Then I'll come back to the customer feedback. We have already discussed a little bit on that. The request on the project. This is about reusability. How many projects do we do? How many projects do we create in our environment, more stable environment? Example is how customer sees the value in this from a project implementation perspective, and how we can bring on a lot of more automation. We also look at a lot of agile based data and do a crunching around it to understand how we are performing from a project request standpoint. Then there comes the major incident. Now, this major incident is not about how many times major incident happens. This is about looking at when the major incident happens or when the crisis happens, how are we reacting as an organization or as a service provider? Okay, the customers at times pay If I talk about the operations world, they pay you 365 days, and sometimes these crises don't even happen for years, but they do pay for you, right? And the point is, when it does happen, they pay because they need a reliable ally at the time of the crisis, right? And that's the reason, we have to ensure and we need to understand how did we perform as a service provider about when actually the crisis happened. And we give it a lot of weightage, a 10% weightage for that, because that's the cornerstone, one of the cornerstones, I would say, about how, a customer or an end user perceives you as a reliable service provider. Then it is about availability and fault tolerance, and these are again very contractually obligated things. What is the availability of the system, and things around it, and obviously with the advent of cloud, a lot of these things are much easier. And team from a stability and contractual perspective will look into it. Latency, again, non-functional requirement. How is the entire application or the user experience behaving? So we obviously document that. We do run a lot of business process monitoring, a lot of end user monitoring, a lot of obviously infrastructure and application monitoring is there. We do a lot of crunching on that. We apply a lot of advanced data science logics to ensure and come out with things which are not visible on analysis on a Excel and for a naked eye, but we do come out with a performance perspective, and then we try to improve it. And these are some of the factors which we consider. Now, based on these factors, so how do we roll this out? The idea about this is very simple. When you roll this out for a particular team or a squad, we call it the squad. So in our organization, we had 98 squads who are providing same or different services across the globe for different customers whom we have. Now, all of these parameters are being assessed by the SREs in the internet. So this is the first step when you roll out something like this to a team. So we look at all of these data. This is also handheld by a horizontal bootstrapping, which we have. These are the SREs across the organization who are responsible for all the SREs in each and every team, okay, in different units. They all, analyze this, come out with a backlog which talks about, okay, these are the improvements which we have to do to raise these SLOs. Now, for each of these parameters which we are talking about, we define SLO for each of them. We define action plans for each of them. Now, how do you prioritize it? The reason, the only way to prioritize it when you look at what the customer needs, and then you based on that you do it. We don't prioritize things based on the fact that it's going to get me another green dashboard. That's not the intent. It is always about how the end user looks at it. So this number crunching is done. The backlogs are put in place, and then the SLOs are defined. Obviously, the corresponding SLI dashboards are in place just to see how we are performing. And then this activity is done for each and every squad. I'll give you a simple example. Even if we are doing OS-based operations, every customer is different, every monitoring setup is different, every SLAs are different. The configurations on the monitoring is different. So one size fit all will not work. So it is a hard work initially for SREs to get into the team, define all of this, and start working on it. Apart from obviously the other things which they do when the crisis comes and things of that sort, right? So SREs mostly work on all of these, which are already defined, and try to bring in more reliability into it. We talked about this already. This is about the details which we wanted to do, and there's one particular about change quality on the left hand side second, which I'm going to take as an example going forward, uh, where I was talking about the failure budget concept, right? So what we do is pick out a team based on the data which has great success rate on change or deployment. You measure the risk of that particular team by looking at the data. For example, after every major release, they did not have more than, ideally there should be zero incidents from the system, but we give a weightage of up to one or two, and those also should be minor. If we look at a constant path for them, that for last, say, some time, they have been really working very hard from a perspective of making it a very reliable setup from a deployment standpoint or from a change standpoint. Then we give a scoring mechanism. And that scoring mechanism is that we provide them with credit points. Like, for example, we provide them 2 credit points and say, all right, guys, you are free to go through the deployment at your will and wish. You can internally have your own approval board, and you will be allowed to pass through all the quality gates for now. You can, jump over it. You don't have to go through it. The point is, this will only happen after you have defined an SLO, which will obviously be a much, much more steeper target than what is an SLA, because we have, based on the technical analysis which has been done, we have defined an SLO. The teams have agreed to it, the SREs have agreed to it that yes, we can reach there. And when they perform this deployment without any quality gate involved, they shall not breach the SLO. They cannot go below that at any point of time. If they are read on some of these SLOs, then obviously a deduction is done. And if they do it 2 consecutive times, they go back all the way to the quality gate again, through all the quality gates. And then we obviously do an internal RC to understand why we were not able to meet that. And then they have to earn back these credit points by showing real improvements. And that's the job of an SRE to do, right? And then they can get back to the real level which they wish to. So this is one of the examples which we have from a perspective of how we define failure budget. There's another example which I want to really discuss upon is assessment of site reliability engineer. Now, if you roll out a SRE based setup to organization, chances are that you might or might not have all the SREs in place. That means you have to assess some of the smart guys in the organization who can perform the role of an SRE, and it is not something which is very difficult. The assessment is based on quadrant-based setup, which we have, and assessment has to be done for each and every one of them. We have to always reiterate the fact that SRE is much more a cultural shift than what people can imagine, more than what the technical shift is, right? And for that, we also put in a 22-point, assessment criteria, and that does not mean that the person has to be super technical, brilliant, or anything of that sort. Obviously, it's to be hands-on. You should have problem-solving, mindset to him or her. But the entire concept is around how much they can apply these principles and how much they can learn on this framework and go through. Right now, once these SLOs are defined, SLOs are defined, and they start, working on that, that's when comes the other factors of site reliability engineering, which is about where do we put automation, where do we put in things like advanced monitoring, usage of data science, and so on and so forth. That's the value which we bring in, which is about, okay, this is what we want to reach, but where to reach is totally dependent on the framework of how you define an SLO for each and every squad which is delivering the service in a shared model. It's one-time difficult activity to start with, but once you start getting into the groove, it really starts becoming easier and also helps you in getting through things pretty quickly. Right now, we did not cover on one of the value part, which is about toil reduction, which obviously is inculcated because the SLOs are going to be much more steeper than the SLAs and the ways of working which we have. So basically, we are shaving out any extra fat we have in the system. But there are many things which teams do which are not recorded, which are not part of this data crunching which we are talking about. And we have to be very careful on that, because that is why the SREs have to go into the teams. They should be part of the team. They should know what happens on a day-to-day basis. It cannot be a separate team. One of the anti-patterns is people define a separate SRE team and then they think that they will help the real teams who are actually doing the work, be it deployment, development, or be it operations. So we have to be very cognizant of that. That's one of the things which we have to keep in mind when it comes to tangible benefits. The second is the SLOs are the tangible benefits. We have a target. We have to reach the target, and we will work towards it. It's just a framework. It's just a structured approach of trying to reach there, right? Weightage must be customer centric. There is no question on that. And one of the anti-patterns is that sometimes people, in trying to reach some numbers because they have rolled out site reliability engineering, tend to forget the customer part of it or the end user part of it. And we have to prioritize it, because it is the direct impacts which are going to be there. Those are the real tangible numbers which will be shown from a customer and a quantitative standpoint, rather than just some dashboards based on some analysis on any of the front-end based tools. Focus should be reliability. The name itself suggests site reliability engineering. So reliability has to be the focus. The service has to be perceived as reliable. This is one attempt from our side to make it a framework of this sort, which provides you that reliability flavor. SLO has to be defined for non-recoverable items. I've touched on that already. That SLOs need to be defined based on some of the non-recordable items, things which are done by the teams which are not recorded at all, but it does require some time. And it has to be SLOs which are tangible, real SLOs which can be reached. And that's why SREs have to take a call how much they can raise the SLO bar all the time, and it has to be tracked. So that's all I had for today. Thanks a lot for your time and listening up. And please feel free to connect with me at any point of time if you need more clarity on this. And all of these details are on my blog, which is www.rohitsinha.in. Thank you.